We know that there were four letters for sure that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. We have two of them. We've lost two through time. There was a first letter, and then there was what we know as 1 Corinthians. And then there is another letter that Paul calls the severe letter because he had to rebuke the Corinthian church for some things that they were misunderstanding and some things that they weren't doing correctly. So Paul wrote them this severe letter, and then he wrote them 2 Corinthians. The severe letter was such a sharp and harsh rebuke of the church in Corinth that the Apostle Paul wasn't sure how they were going to take it. Sometimes as pastors and spiritual leaders, you need to be strong with people. You need to say strong words to them. But it's always done in love, and you don't know how that's going to land on the field. It's like Jesus said, you cast your seed upon the rocks, you cast them upon the path, or you cast them upon fertile soil where they will set and grow. And the Apostle Paul rebuked the church so severely and so harshly that he was afraid that the Corinthian church was going to completely reject him. 2 Corinthians is an interesting book because it's a magnificent treatise in what it means to suffer correctly for Jesus. It's also a letter of thanksgiving for the Corinthian church accepting the Apostle Paul's rebuke. Sometimes suffering means hearing things we don't want to hear. Sometimes suffering means hearing things that hurt our feelings. But when it's done correctly, as the Apostle Paul did, it helps growth. It's like pruning bushes. You could let your bushes get out of hand and grow, but they're not healthy. You prune them back, and they're healthy bushes. I just did that a couple weeks ago at my house. The ferns were starting to take over. The blackberry bushes, the alders and the cedars were starting to get out of hand, and I pruned them back, and now the yard looks better. Sometimes that needs to happen in our life, too. Before we get started in the actual word this morning, I wanted to relay a story with you that I recently heard by a man named N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright was I just had a brain lapse. The Archbishop of Canterbury, that's what he was. He was the head guy of the church in England, the Anglican Church, and he had held that post for a number of years. And he had the ability, since he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, to meet royalty. And he happened to meet Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, not Queen Elizabeth II, but the first one. And she was the regent of Great Britain with her husband during the Second World War. And during the bombings of London that the Germans did on London, at first it didn't touch any of the royal properties, but the further and further it got into the war, Buckingham Palace started getting bombed, and Whitehall and Wycliffe Hall and all those places started getting bombed. And pretty soon, the whole east side of Buckingham Palace was in ruins. And it just so happens that the east side of Buckingham Palace faces the east end of London, which there were a lot of poor people back in that day. And N.T. Wright relays a story that he was talking to her one day, and he was asking her about what it was like to be a person of royalty during World War II, getting bombed by the Germans. And Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, said, it was important to me because with the east end of the Buckingham Palace gone, I was able to see what it felt like to be on the east end. Because she could look out at all of her subjects. All of her subjects' houses were in ruin. All of their belongings had been bombed and destroyed, and now she was experiencing it too. You see, the interesting thing about Christianity, which sets itself apart from every other religion in the world, is that our God is the only God who put on human flesh, entered into our experience, put on the clothes of suffering, and was subject even to death itself. Jesus, like Queen Elizabeth I, the Queen Mother, experienced what it was like to suffer. And a lot of times as Christians, we don't like to hear the word suffering. But it's something that we must all do. It's part of human experience. We can't detach ourselves from it. We can't disengage. It's part of who we are as people. The thing that matters most and what distinguishes us amongst everybody else in the world is how we react to suffering. This is important. And this morning, I want you to hear the words of the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 11. He says this, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, to the church of God in Corinth, together with all the saints throughout Achaia. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. For just as the sufferings of Christ flow over into our lives, so also through Christ our comfort overflows. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same sufferings we suffer. And our hope for you is firm, because we know that just as you share in our suffering, so also you share in our comfort. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life itself. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such deadly peril, and He will deliver us. On Him we have set our hopes that He will continue to deliver us. As you help us by your prayers, then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favor granted us in answer to the prayers of many. Of course, before we get too far along this morning, we need to talk about some historical context to help us understand what the Apostle Paul is writing about. We know that the Corinthian church, as I mentioned, was a young church. It was fairly secluded from the sufferings of many other Christian churches. It wasn't like the church in Jerusalem, who was under constant pressure and persecution and torment from the Roman and Jewish authorities in the area. It wasn't like the churches in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, that was constantly being pressured and persecuted. The church in Corinth was a relatively prosperous church. Corinth was a relatively prosperous place. The interesting thing about Corinth is that 200 years before the Apostle Paul wrote his letters to the Corinthian church, Corinth was completely leveled by the Romans. It was completely destroyed. No brick was left unturned. And for about 120 years, the Romans wouldn't let anybody rebuild in Corinth. The Romans had made it kind of a dump site. It was a place where they took their trash. This once glorious Greek city was once in ruins. But over time, the Romans became lax about how they approached Corinth, and they let people resettle there. They let people rebuild there. And it became a flourishing, prosperous port city because it sits on an isthmus. To the north was a very important port. To the south was a very important port. And all of the trade happened there for all of the Roman Empire. Anything going to Rome went through Corinth. Anything going to Alexandria in Egypt went through Corinth. So it was a very important city. And the Apostle Paul is writing this letter of 2 Corinthians to help the Corinthian church understand what it means to own your suffering redemptively. Because Jesus promised us in the Gospels that we will have suffering. We will have hardship. We will have trials. We will have things that seem unable to overcome. It seems like they're going to defeat you, and it's important that we learn how it is that we live in face of all of this. And so the Apostle Paul sets out this letter to the Corinthian church, 2 Corinthians, based mostly on his personal experience. The Apostle Paul wasn't somebody so high and lofty that he was able to skirt through life with no suffering. He was the king of suffering. He was beaten with rods and whipped. He was shipwrecked, left naked and cold and hungry. He was stoned, even almost to the point of death. He was thrown in prison multiple times for his faith in Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul didn't live a comfy, cushy life. The Apostle Paul wasn't so far above it that he just skirted through life without any scars, without any trials. The Apostle Paul was down in the middle of it, and he gloried in his suffering. What would it be like if every Christian on the face of the earth lived with that mentality? There are many Christians in modern-day America who think that Christianity somehow grants you some kind of magical powers, fulfills all your wishes. That's kind of like a genie in a bottle. Whenever you need money, you just send a check into Benny Hinn or Jimmy Swaggart, and God will return it 100-fold, pressed down, shaken together, and overflowing. The sad thing is that that has become the message of Christianity without recognizing that Christianity is a religion of suffering. And what's interesting to me is that this suffering is so integral to our belief and to our faith that God Himself entered into it with us. On Wednesday night, we've been talking about apologetics, and a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the problem of evil and suffering. What does that mean for us? How do we live with it? How do we overcome it? It's a pretty powerful objection to faith in God. And 2 Corinthians, the book itself, is a theodicy, a defense of what it means to believe in a God of all goodness, all love, all power, and yet we're in the middle of suffering. The Apostle Paul, when he was writing the letter of 2 Corinthians, was in the church at Ephesus. Ephesus is directly across the Aegean Sea from Corinth. If you wanted to, you could take a ferry there even today. There's dozens and dozens of ferries that run between the two places. Like I said last week, it would take you about 90 hours if you were to go on foot, take the ferry. You have to hop across several different islands, but eventually you'll end up in Corinth from Ephesus. And the Apostle Paul, we know from our message last week that something tremendous was happening in Ephesus. There was a revival that broke out. Everybody was getting saved and filled with the Holy Spirit. But then the Apostle Paul tells us, he concludes 1 Corinthians with this praise. There's a tremendous work in Ephesus. And then he opens up 2 Corinthians, and something has happened. Something drastic has happened in Ephesus. What was once a prosperous and flourishing ministry in Ephesus now seems to have hit a roadblock, a speed bump, a problem. And the Apostle Paul is writing the Corinthian church, telling them of everything that's going on in Ephesus. And he even says in there that they don't want them to be misinformed with what's happening in Ephesus. It could be like the Chinese telephone game. Have you ever played that when you sit in a big circle? You say something to the person next to you, and then they say something, and you say something, goes around the circle, and by the time it gets back to the original person, the message is completely different. So the Apostle Paul is writing the Corinthian church with his own hand, relaying to them everything that's happening in Ephesus, because he doesn't want them to be misinformed. In Acts chapter 19, the Apostle Paul, which runs parallel with all of Paul's epistles, tells us what's happening in Ephesus during this time. The Apostle Paul is preaching in Ephesus. He's winning many people over to Christ. And the pagans in Ephesus, the people who plied their wares making graven images and idols out of metal and wood, were starting to lose business because nobody's buying idols anymore. Everybody's converting over to the Christian faith. So, of course, like all things, the Ephesian pagans needed to find a scapegoat of why they're losing money. Their way of life is going away, and they found the Apostle Paul. There's a man in Acts chapter 19 that we hear about from Luke. His name was Demetrius. He was a metallurgist, somebody who made pagan idols for all the people worshiping pagan gods in Ephesus, and he was starting to lose money. His way of life was being destroyed. His family and his living wage was being taken away because he couldn't afford to pay his bills anymore. All these snowballing problems happening. The Apostle Paul is ruining my life. So Demetrius sets out. He goes about to all the other metal workers and woodworkers in Ephesus, telling them, hey, this Apostle Paul is a bad character. He's ruining business for us. And he starts a riot. It's called the Demetrius riot if you look at it from a theological perspective. And Demetrius sets out to persecute Paul because he's taking away his living. And they plan on driving the Apostle Paul out of Ephesus. And the Apostle Paul eventually leaves Ephesus for fear of his life. He's going to die if it escalates any further. And it wasn't just Demetrius and 10 people. It was Demetrius and hundreds, if not thousands of people set out to kill Paul for what he's preaching. So the Apostle Paul leaves Ephesus. He goes to a place called Lystra, where he's going to wait for Titus to meet him up there to bring him word of the church of Corinth. And the Apostle Paul was so afraid for his life that when he sits down to pen 2 Corinthians, he says that he doesn't want the Corinthian church to be misinformed about what's happening. And he starts telling them that he fears for life itself. He says this in verse 8. Let's look at that really quickly. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. Ephesus was in Asia, which is now modern-day Turkey. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. You see, the Apostle Paul was under severe persecution. And it was like this wherever he went. We know that he was stoned at one place. He was thrown in prison at Thessalonica. He was driven out of Thessalonica later and ended up in Athens, Greece. All of the Apostle Paul's life was based in suffering. But the thing that the Apostle Paul was able to do with it was he was able to trust and hope in that Jesus was who he said he was. That Jesus did what he said he did. That Jesus can do what he said he can do for us. And this completely changed the paradigm in his mind. Did you notice what the Apostle Paul said at the end of that sentence? Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. You see, when you have that eternal perspective in mind, everything for you changes. The way that you approach life changes. The way that you approach other people changes, because behind it all you have this great promise of hope that this world isn't the only thing there is. And we can live confidently because we know that even though we suffer, even though we die, even though we face overwhelming obstacles and hardships in this life, it's not all there is. I want to read something with you this morning, and I think it fits perfectly in with what we're talking about. Nicholas Wolterstorff, a great Christian philosopher, wrote these words while reflecting on suffering himself. God is love. That is why he suffers. To love our suffering, sinful world is to suffer. God so suffered for the world that he gave up his only Son to suffering. The one who does not see God's suffering does not see his love. God is suffering love. So suffering is down at the center of things, deep down where the meaning is. Suffering is the meaning of our world, for love is the meaning, and love suffers. The tears of God are the meaning of history. But mystery remains. Why isn't love without suffering the meaning of things? Why is suffering love the meaning? Why does God endure his suffering? Why does he not at once relieve his agony by relieving ours? We're in it together, God and we, together in the history of our world. The history of our world is the history of our suffering together. Every act of evil extracts a tear from God. Every plunge into anguish extracts a sob from God. But also the history of our world is the history of our deliverance together. God's work to release himself from his suffering is his work to deliver the world from its agony. Our struggle for joy and justice is our struggle to relieve God's sorrow. You see, God is a suffering God too. Jesus donned human flesh, put on a mortal coil so that he could enter into our experience. You see, God isn't some aloof God who sits on a white throne, only doing what's perceived to be royal things. Just like the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth I, God experiences suffering too. And as Christians, because we believe in the one who raises the dead, we don't have to fear of life itself, because there's something behind this life too. And your suffering means something to God. Your pain means something to God. Your hardships and your trials mean something to God. And it's not without merit, and it's not without need, and it's not without accomplishment for you. When you own your suffering redemptively, you receive a prize far greater than anything you can imagine. In a few weeks, we'll hear the Apostle Paul telling us that this brief and momentary affliction is building up for us an eternal weight of glory that surpasses anything our mind could ever comprehend. If only we